Hi, my name is Tobe Sexton, and I'm with Games Scribes. We're formerly GTL Media, and we are a localization and translating and testing company. And we have headquarters in Los Angeles, and we've now recently established offices here in the Southeast, namely in the Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill area, known as the Research Tech Triangle. But we are actually expanding, and we're very excited to be here at Siege. So thank you very much to all the people that have allowed us to be here. So I was basically going to be doing a panel just kind of explain what's going on. And because of the hurricane and a couple of other instances, we have basically kind of narrowed this down to where I am going to be speaking. So I have my notes, so everyone just bear with me a little bit, and I'm going to try to get into everything we can possibly get into, and also any kind of questions that you may have to help you guys establish or understand. This panel or talk is on localization and localizing for world cultures, and the prep, the crunch, and the aftermath. Now, one of the things we're going to do is we're going to get your game ready for global domination. Is it ready? That's the question. And we're also going to discuss what kind of things it takes to be able to localize a game and get it ready for different regions and different cultures, and also assessing the viability of your game in international marketplace. And if you'll be prepared for any updates or culturalization issues that may pop up, and also review if you're going to be ready and remain culturally relevant as you extend your global reach. So a couple things really. There's only like three or four when it comes down to it. But the main thing I want to get into is communication. All right, translation, localization is really about communicating with the world, and also communicating with your teams, communicating with your localization vendor. There are several ways that localization can happen. It can either be through a publisher. Maybe you get brought onto a publisher and they handle localization, or they handle it through a third party, or sometimes the publisher will put it onto you and make you actually have to do the localization for yourself, and then they will prep it, they will check it, and have different people, either through different means, to test it and see if it's good or ready, or they just rely that you're going to know what you're doing and you don't want your game to get out there and not do well. We'll say that. It's a nice way of saying it. So that's the major thing, communication. Think of your localization partner as part of your team, an extension of yourself. Right? If you could afford to have a localization company or your own localization department, then you more than likely might. There are several companies that do. Facebook has their own. Blizzard does. A lot of companies actually have their own localization departments. They can afford that because they have such an influx of work that's coming in all the time that they're actually able to sustain that and support that. Right? But if you're an indie developer, if you're just starting out, or if you've got your first game, third game, or whatever, or you don't want the overhead, that's why you bring it into a localization company. And my best thing I can really emphasize is to utilize your localization company as, like I said, a part of your company, as your department. Go to them, ask them questions about localization, ask them about territories, ask them about regions, ask them about fonts. Right? And we're going to get into a couple other things that we can actually get into whenever you get out your game to the world and you run into issues, you run into tickets, then go back and say, hey, I got this ticket, I got this issue. Don't be afraid to communicate with them. Right? Because if a game is translated well, then you're going to look at an uptick of about 30% of what you would normally get. Right? If you just released everything in English, you're going to remain around here. And if people like your game, they're going to download your game, they're going to buy your game. Word of mouth is going to spread that the game is good. Right? It's going to remain around here, and it's going to maybe go up or maybe go down. It's going to, maybe if it's an indie game, a lot of times it'll get a good release and it'll raise back up again a little bit. But if you start seeing an uptick in here, that might be a good time to localize if you haven't already, if you're an indie game. Right? That's what I like to talk about a lot of times, about the indie games. Because a lot of times the AAA publishers, they kind of have it in the bag. We deal with a lot of them, but they actually seem to know where they are and how to do it. They know their regions. They look at the game. They try to figure out where it's going to be the most viable for their money. Right? Because localization is kind of the cringe, the effect of the thing no one wants to deal with when it comes to the devs. To the producers. No one wants to deal with that too much, but they kind of have to because it's a saving grace for the publisher. And when you get it out there, you get it out to the world, and once you actually translate the game and it's done well, then you end up with a 30% uptick, and sometimes up to 50% uptick, and it'll maintain and drop down to around 30%. right, with what you would have normally gotten. Now, counter to that, if you do poor localization, right, if you use, I don't want to say anything bad about Google Translate, right? It is a term that people use in the industry, right? And even for us, all of our stuff is done with hands-on in-territory translators, and that's what you want. You want that from no matter who you're dealing with. If you're going to get it done, you want it done with a person looking at it, a person reading it, a person looking at it contextually. This, games specifically. We all have games, right? Do we all make games here? Raise your hands. Yes. Excellent. Yeah. So basically, you want to be able to have it so it's happy for the games. So it's good for gaming. Gaming isn't just something that you would just read off. It's not legal text. It's not technical jargon. It's not something that you can just basically look at and translate. There's a soul to it. There's a being to it. And every game is specific next to every other game. And even if you have an RPG, it doesn't mean it's the same RPG as somebody else's RPG. You have certain things, certain funny things, certain flair that exists within your game that doesn't exist in somebody else's game. It's part of your sense of humor. It's part of your gaming culture. It's part of your company's life. And you're going to be bringing in people that are going to trust you. And if you're a newbie and this is your first game, you're going to start building an audience. And they're going to trust that the game you make is going to be of a certain quality or a certain style or a certain flair. And they're going to go back into you for that. I mean, you know what I'm talking about, right? We all have gaming companies that we all really go back to, that we go, oh, they're coming out with a new game, right? There's a reason for that, because you trust them, right? And that's what you want to do. You want to build trust with your client. You want to build trust, because one of my favorite examples is, it's about communication, right? Whenever you're out dating, right? When you're out dating, you're meeting people. You might meet a million people, right? You may go on dates. You may kind of date somebody for a while. You think you're communicating well. You think you're getting along. Some of you are laughing out there, right? And all of a sudden, one day, you go, I don't think this person gets me. I don't think this person understands me. And you reach out, and you try to communicate. You try to say, hey, I don't like this, or I don't like that, or do you understand what I'm saying? Or they may come to you and say the same thing, right? And it's just, there's a lack of communication because you're not translating well to each other. Right? You're having difficulty communicating. Well, what you want is you try to find that person, or maybe those people, depending on what your lifestyle is. I'm not judging. But you find that person that you actually really communicate with, that you understand, that you really like, and you decide to create usually a lifelong bond of some kind. A friendship, right? A marriage, partnership, whatever it is. Those are the people you stay with. Those are people you always go back to, right? Because there's trust there. Right? And that's what good localization should be. It should allow you to connect with the person who's playing your game, the gamer out there, the person who's interested, or your app, or whatever it is that you create. Right? And that way they look at it and they go, wow, this is something I'm going to stick with. This is something that I'm going to buy into, and I'm going to commit to, and I'm going to enjoy a lifelong relationship with. And that's what good localization will do for you. Any questions? All right, cool. All right, yeah. So anyway, the next thing I want to go into is what the services are to go over and achieve a AAA localization. Right? AAA is like a term. Everyone familiar with AAA? What that means? Okay. Well, AAA is whenever you're actually it's a certain quality level of a game. It's usually for the higher studios. They've established a certain level ever since they came out with the games in the 80s and 90s where they first started doing localization, and they ended up basically saying, hey, let's go from Japanese to English, and they use text, heavy text based, right? And we all played those games. We all love those games, right? A lot of games we love, and so that's kind of where it all started from. Right? Now it's grown into a whole thing, and you want to have AAA quality no matter what it is. No matter how big your game is, how small your game is. Right? You need to assess the level that you are willing to commit and what you have, not just in a budgetary fashion, but also how big you think your audience is going to be. What kind of commitment? Because good localization does cost money, right? And you want to get a company that actually knows what they're doing and is established in the industry, right? Again, we want to keep away from Google Translate. That's a literal translation. If you have if you go up and you put a word like, let's say, squash, Can we say the word squash? We all know what squash means, right? Right. When I first said squash, who thought of a vegetable? Raise your hand. Okay. Who thought of getting smashed or crushed? Okay. Right? About half and half. So that's the question, isn't it? And as a human translator, you can still make a mistake. You could still say, even with context, you may be like, that's interesting. If I'm going to get squashed in the crush, what does that mean to you? What does that mean to you? If you're translating it and you speak a whole other language, as English is your second language, which is what we do, you may have some issues. So you have context issues. So the first thing you want to do is you want to get AAA quality. You actually have somebody that translates with in-territory translators, where English is normally their second or third language, right? And they do a translation and they edit their own work. Then they send it back to the translation house. Then they get it out to a second translator, who's an editor, a senior editor. Right? They do the work twice as fast usually. Your normal translator handles anywhere between 2,000 to 3,000 words a day, and your senior translator or editor handles anywhere between 4,000 to 6,000 words a day. Right? All that's good. It's great. You're getting it done. They're looking for context. But first, you're looking at it for grammatical errors, the basic stuff. They're going to look at it to make sure that it works within with context as much as they can, given context clues, and they'll come back and they'll ask for context clues. So make sure whenever you're actually getting things localized and translated that you actually are going to have assets that you can give your translation company, and you're ready to answer those questions about what is this word? What is the crush? What is the crush? And they say, oh, well, basically it's just kind of like a surfing term, getting crushed, again, you're getting squashed in the crush. It's a thing. Okay, well, that's a little bit higher level. That goes to maybe we need to go to a third editor to take a look at it, a third translator to look at it, who has even a more creative writing eye. They can translate that into the multiple languages, the 32 or the 70 languages that you're actually translating to, so that it makes sense within the context and the culture of that you're trying to reach out to. Right? So that's how basically the translation works. Then once you're done with your secondary translation, they get that back to you and they go, okay, this is fantastic. Or the third, you go, okay, this is great. Then we give it back to you. The translation company gives it back to you. You load it into your game. You integrate it as best you can. And then you look at it and you say, here it is. You give it back to them. They look at the build. They do what's called linguistic quality assurance testing. Linguistic quality assurance testing is basically they look at the game. They look at it for context. They look at it for genre, but also look for overruns. They look for technical issues. Because sometimes whenever you actually load the game back in, it can mess with your code, depending on the font that you used, depending on the things that are already established in the game. If you're using Russian, if you use all caps, if you decide in your game it just goes to all caps, then you're going to be basically maybe posting up gibberish because the cap usage in Russian changes the meaning, how it is. Also you're dealing with languages, say like Thai, that can be up to a 4-tier language, which is basically it has not only just the regular character, it has an accent mark which decides if it's kind of an extra lift. It also has a tonal change in it. It also has a change in it basically about how you're going to where you put an extra emphasis on it. I don't speak Thai, but this is what I'm told. But those extra little markers, can really mess with code and also make you come out of your text boxes or however you're actually dealing with it. Also with Japanese, there are no spaces. We all want to go out to Japanese. I recommend it. Japanese is fantastic, right? They give us games, we give them games. They love games. That's what they do, right? So in general, that's what you want to get out to if you can. So you got to be aware of this. So we do LQA testing. That's what you want to do next. And then they will give it back to you and they will give you notes. They will give you script changes. At least they should. If they don't, then you say, hey, what are the notes and script changes? And you may even run into a global issue, in which case you want to get an update from them every single day. And I'm telling you this because these are notes you should be taking as you're getting localization. You should make sure that you're getting these things. Make sure you're getting notes. Make sure you're getting the changes every day. And there where you can bring it in, you can load it in, and then they can check and look at it and do a regression on it to specifically those areas that are the problem. And Yeah, because you want to find out what they are. You want to make sure that your testing companies, you want to make sure you're budgeted for it also, that they actually have the time to be able to go in and do an initial sweep and then give you the notes, and then they get it back to do it. And make sure you do, please, make sure that you do that, you give it back to them so they can do the regression and they can do a fixed verification sweep. Long story short, had a company, as I pull it out, right? A big company. They're a big company. They're a huge company. They do mobile games. And when we first started with them, they gave us all of their languages to assess and do an audit, which that's something you can do also. Just have them do an audit, look at it, and see if the language that you've already got or your legacy language, and this is as you get bigger and you have other stuff that you need to do this with. Your publisher may have failed. You may have given your publisher was responsible for all the languages and all the translation, and then they fail and they give it back to you, because it does happen sometimes. Right? They give it back to you, and let's say the Arabic is about a quarter done. You know, your traditional Chinese, there's only like 5% that's not done. You know, your Brazilian Portuguese is completely finished. You know, but your Italian is halfway. It ends up in different issues because there's a reason why the company failed. I'm not saying any names. So I'm under NDA, folks. I'm under NDA. But in general, this is a real thing that happened. So we go back in and we look at it. We do our audit, right? And we discover that the Korean is messed up. Like it's messed up, but it's not that bad. But it needs basically we give them changes. We give them what they need to do, recommendations, and then we expect them to do that. It was about 60% needed changed up. Right? Brazilian Portuguese needed completely reworked from scratch. I mean, literally, I can't say that word, but let's say because it might get some way. But the fact is, let's say that it's flower cat. It's like a character with like a cat with like a flower around it, right? It's a flower cat, right? And the Brazilian Portuguese came back as Daisy. It's not exactly the same thing. It is a flower, but it loses its context. It's more like a name, right? So we read, okay, this has got to be redone. All this has got to be redone. This was consistent. And then like the Arabic was just like somebody sat on the keyboard. It was just like, right? So we relooked at that. Right. Now what ended up happening is with this one company, I'm amalgamating companies, by the way, so when people are watching this back, they know I'm not actually talking about just one company. I'm amalgamating companies. But this one company had given it back to their devs, and basically they approved it and said that everything was loaded and everything looks great. We're like, fantastic. So as we're going forward with the translations, our editors are going off of the glossary and the terms that have been established as being correct and good in the game. And at that point, if it's been established and it's solid, they may give some notes periodically, but their job is to, at that point, to match what's done, so that way it's consistent throughout the game. And this is about like getting ready for updates. All right, I'm talking about like we've done the translation now. I'm skipping ahead. So, but this is about now we're going into, you've reached out to the world, you've expanded, you have an audience, right? So now you've got to like do updates, especially if you've got a mobile game. A lot of the online games now, even games that had been console games at one point, are now uploading to Steam. They've poured it out, right? We're getting this a lot right now, where they've gone out, now they've got an online version, and they've opened up the world. You know, there's one game I'm working on right now, and it was actually a pretty popular game for Xbox, and now they've ported it out to Steam, and they had one single character that you followed in the original version, but now they've got several characters you can choose from and you can play within this world, right? It's kind of exciting, right? But what's happened is, you know, like with this one company as an example, they didn't give it back to us. Once we actually did the LQA, they failed to give it back to us. They said, it's fine, it's good, we did it. Because they didn't want to spend the extra money. And they're a good company that actually is very successful, right? But what happened is when they integrated it back into their sheets, something went wrong. Someone did like, they're using Google Sheets, which I don't necessarily recommend. Again, Google, you're awesome, I love you, Google. But you know, you make my life fantastic, thank you. But the problem is with keeping track of like, you know, variations, making sure that basically you're basically keeping up with your versioning. And it's hard to do that because if somebody messes up, they go, oh, and they click back and they double click, then you've lost work. And the only people that know that, hopefully, is your translation company, and hopefully they gave you the TM, which is translation memory, background on it. So you can actually then go back and you can verify yourself. But these people, these company, they went out, our customers, our clients, our friends. They went out and they basically they put out the game with this old text. So they're getting tickets right and left, which goes back to a whole other thing I'm going to talk about being able to be ready for when that happens. Because when they come in, these tickets are going to come in, and these issues are going to come in another language. Right? You've opened up your world to your game to these territories, to these regions. And these people are excited about it. And let's say you got the uptick, you're doing great. Hey. But what everyone is Brandon Hoffman. In a second. I think you're good for right now. I'm on a roll right now, so it's a Kaiser roll. It's pretty good. Everyone's but what you want to do is basically you want to be able to look at, and you want to be able to answer these questions. So it's good to have somebody on hand that can either be responsible for that, a community manager, a marketing person that's responsible for that region. And actually that's how this company ended up discovering these issues with specifically, let's say, Korean, to pull a name out of my hat. Word, right? They found it because they started getting more specific. They started broadening. They started finding, because they wanted to expand, so they brought in a marketing group that was just for Korean and just for Japanese and just for German. And so they started looking at the text and going, well, this is not good. And we're like, what do you mean it's not good? They're like, well, it's not good. And we've already added, say, like 3,000 words. When we got the game, it was only 1,500. Now it's 3,000 words, and we've replaced half the words or the text that we actually had initially. Right, so the whole thing switched, but we're still keeping with the same glossary because that's what we thought we'd given them. And I don't speak Korean, and our project managers don't speak Korean, and our people that speak Korean are still going, I don't know, I guess you want to use it. Right, so I'm just doing my job. So then finally they came to us with notes, and they're like, hey, this is messed up. And we go, what do you mean? So we went back and showed them our versioning, and they went, oh. Well, that was, okay, I guess, right. So my long story to get to the short answer is make sure that once you do get LQA done, you've paid the money for your linguistic testing, the translation's been done, translation company gave it to you, you've given them back the build, they've done the testing, they've given you the notes. Make sure you do the second part. Very important, right? Make sure you do the regression and the fixed verification. Right? It takes about half the time as the initial LQA, and you can bet it's going to be probably your LQA initially is going to be around 2,000 to 3,000 words per day. So depending on how many words of text you have, right? Depending on how complicated the game is, it might take longer. When it's needed to actually get through the game and hit all the codes and everything. I've worked on stuff that's just regular, match 3 games, clicker games, levelers, to where actually full on RPGs. Where those are a little bit difficult because you actually have to have somebody that's kind of sprinting through and somebody that's doing more comprehensive and pulling up different codes in different areas, error codes. And then also just basically things that are more Autodesk kind of stuff, for companies that do, the face recognition stuff and all that stuff. So we do all those things. But you want to make sure that you always have some kind of test. We have a few companies that actually I would recommend if you do any manuals as well. Your translation company does the manuals. Either see if they can do the kind of a layout, localization of the layout to make sure they lay back in the text properly so that it matches the original layout of your manual. Or if you do it, you say, we'll just load it in. We got that. We don't need to spend the extra $100 or whatever per page or whatever it is, and whatever they're going to charge me. We can do that. But then have them do a read-through. Have them do a read-through of the manual. Right. We actually do that for a company, and it's a Japanese company, and they come out with 1 billion games. They have right now I think we're at 24 games that they publish, and we go through them, and I would say every third manual that we put together for them, there's 4 or 5 issues. 4 or 5 issues that they needed to have checked. I have an issue right now with something where it's looking at the controller. and next to the controller it has the designated the buttons what they're for, right? What the switches are for, and so it says switch. Again, I say the word switch. How many of you think of like a clicker, like a switch, like you'd switch, right? How many raise your hand? Right? About half. How many of you think it's like switching a weapon? Right? I would say actually that's about a third. And how many of you think it's like your character switches from one character to another different kind of character within the context of running the game? I had one person that raised their hand. All right? The answer is it's switching from one type of character or animal into another type of animal while you're in mid play. So that's the one that it is. And apparently in certain languages, there's a difference between the word switch. We're very broad with our language in English, right? We have several meanings for one word, but as you get into Japanese, Korean, Chinese, they're very specific. They have certain, characters that combine together that have totally different meanings. So basically, it got translated to light switch, and so they're like, "How did this happen?" We're like, "Well, we didn't get the context clue, and we also didn't have a chance to read through on your manual." So, and especially a lot of another things you also need to figure out is if you're going to be designating in alphabetical terms whenever you're loading out. Those are things also you need to watch out for. Again, I guess I'm mostly saying, hey, if you see issues, your translation company wants to make sure that there are no issues. Your translation company wants to make sure that you are aces, that you do that it gets out there and everyone says, oh, this is the best translation I've ever read. Thank you so much for translating. I love this game. I've been waiting for it. And it's the translation is the best I've ever seen in my life. As a matter of fact, I downloaded just the text so I could just read it over and over again like a novel. I love it. Thank you. That's what we want. That's what you want. Right? We're on the same team. We work together. Whoever you hire, if your game goes down, they go down. If there's a problem, they're going to go to that translator. They can isolate it down even. Working on a game right now, 1.8 million words. Huge. We've got 7 translators per language working on it because we got to kick it out in like 4 months. Right? They're finding issues. They found some issues. We go, okay, we were able to isolate it down to a specific translator who's one of the newer people that we brought on. And our editor hadn't had a chance to look at it yet because they're doing early batches. So we're like, okay, cool. We know we need to like pay attention to this person, or we need to remove them from the project. Obviously, not something they're that familiar with, because your genre-specific thing is very important as to what genre you're going to, what regions you're going to go to, and if your genre is specific or good for certain regions. So, any questions? Good for questions. All right, excellent. I've explained everything. Everything's wow, amazing. That's great. Actually, Brandon, are you mic'd or are you?
Not yet. There's one up there.
Yeah. Everyone, this is Brandon Hoffman, and he basically, I'll let him introduce himself a little bit once he gets his mic a little bit. You're doing this thing. I want him up here. Basically, he's going to help me out a little in certain, and I'm going to throw to him a couple things.
Room. Now it's off. Yeah.
Switch.
Switch. I'm just assuming it's working. Okay. Uh, sure. I'm Brandon Huffman. I'm an attorney at a firm that works with startups and entrepreneurs in lots of different industries, mostly industry folks. Uh, just recently opened up an Atlanta office. We have a partner down here now, so we're excited about that. And yeah, that's my background.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
He's a nice guy too.
Exciting.
He had a flat tire.
I,
I believe I believe you. You're fine. No, I'm gonna be stepping out. That's basically the idea, the main idea of localization, of what you want to do, and like I said, it's kind of the headache for the developer, but it's the godsend when it comes to the publisher because they go, hey, I want to be able to make some money. You are. Everyone's showing up at once.
So German is the biggest culprit because they have words that are 37,000 characters long. And so if you're used to doing things in English and then say in Chinese like we were, and then you start moving into German, you find out that the majority of all your UI elements are vastly too small to support the German words. And then Russian kind of does it as well. So you do have to be strategic in how you set up your UI elements. But then also at the same time, when you're recording your audio, say you have all of, for example, Smite has a lot of gods that will say certain jokes or say certain lines for tutorials, etc. We ran into some problems where in Portuguese the lines were a little too long, so we would have 30 seconds per clip per line, and it was 2 seconds too short for the Portuguese, so it would cut them off a little too fast. So when you're designing your games, make sure that you take into account ahead of time how long every language you plan on putting in localized with the UI is also with audio is going to be, so you can strategically plan for that.
Yeah.
That answered the question.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the issues we were talking about before about making sure that you actually test it and make sure because that's the only way you're actually going to have a clear understanding of if there is overruns or if there are problems, no matter what's going on. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. I've been standing the whole time, so my legs are tired. So yeah, that's actually it's a very, very good point. It's one of the things that we run into a lot whenever we're trying to help people. And also when you're dealing with German, there's also certain restrictions that you may or may not be aware of, legality-wise, and also with China. Have you dealt with any of those kinds of things, Brandon?
So not with China, really. For me, the biggest issue with China is IP theft more than anything, but that is not a localization or culturalization issue. In other countries, China has them too, but in other countries that I think my clients are more likely to release in, there are restrictions on actual content. Content can't have certain things. The example that everybody goes to when they're talking about this is German blood. German blood apparently is green. There are certain violence restrictions in content in Germany, and if you have a certain amount of gore, you have to turn the blood a different color so that it's not too gory and still looks fake. There's also in Germany's great for this because they're pretty restrictive. There are rules on Nazi propaganda. So if you're making a Wolfenstein kind of game, probably going to have to change a lot of things to release in Germany to comply with the law.
Which they did. Yeah. So do you run any kinds of those issues because you're dealing specifically with China, right?
For us it was with Japan, because basically with similar events we have inside of Smite. If any of you have played Smite, we added the Japanese pantheon, and so we had to be fairly careful of how we put the battle flag symbol, which is also a very cultural symbol as well. But we changed a lot of that stuff in the Chinese environment, very similar to the way they did with Nazi propaganda. It just so happens that the Nazi symbols weren't like German heritage from thousands of years kind of thing, whereas a lot of the Japanese symbolism is very ancient. So we had to be very diplomatic on how we dealt with that. And also things similar to Germany, in China they have a very strict censorship when it comes to certain morality-based things. So one problem we ran into is, if any of you have played Smite, Neith is the character that you play inside the tutorial. And so her base skin was branded as a little too scandalous for the market. So we had to go in and swap her out for her tier 2 skin, which is a little bit more covered. So stuff like that you may not necessarily anticipate, which is why it's always good to have someone, like say a publisher or an employee or some kind of consultant that's aware of these kind of things. You would just never know something like that. And and you don't want that to throw a curveball into your deployment inside of a foreign country.
Also, a lot of times you don't really necessarily know, like nobody knows until it actually happens. There's certain culturalization issues. There's a company that actually we deal with, and they're out of China, and basically they have an incredibly popular game, and it's one of the largest financially rewarding game in the entire world, and they've been trying to figure out how to culturalize into the Western markets, where they literally had a whole effort where they were trying to figure out how to turn their katana swords into broadswords, and they were reskinning every single aspect of the game to make it much more westernized, because they thought that's what they needed to do. And about halfway through this experiment, they realized, oh, we've actually spent a lot of money, we actually didn't need to do this, because in their culture they like things more changed towards their culture, change that make for them. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, you mean like the stylized wise?
Yeah, they like it.
Yes, we did. Like we had a lot of extensive talks with our publisher, Tencent, where they would come and they would give us a whole art review over things, and they would want to change color palettes. For example, the colors mean different things there than they do here. Like for example, typically in the West, green is good. Green is for the go, and good, everything's good. But over there, it's not quite the same. Like red tends to be the more positive color. Just historically, red was like the royal color, etc. And so green is typically bad, has a bad connotation. So stuff like that, where just from ancient history, like I'm not even sure why green is good in the West, but it just is. So that we did run into that, where we'd have to be careful how we design effects on gods or something like that to kind of portray what they are, which is partly one of the reasons why Loki is green. It's because he's considered, more of a devious, not a good god, etc.
That makes sense. Yeah, and also I guess the same thing would be like if you're going out towards any kind of royalty, the difference is that royalty for European is purple.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
So, yeah, this goes into the whole idea of culturalization. And this is stuff that actually not only, and that's the reason, like, I wanted to go over localization first, because localization, translation, is making it so that it appears in the text and language as if it was created in that location, in that locale, right? And that's kind of a third-party thing that needs to be integrated and can be utilized in a very specific way. But culturalization is what we're getting into, which is you have to go through localization before you even get to culturalization. You have to determine like what game and what market you think your game may be appropriate for as well. Not all games are appropriate for all markets. There's an issue with Korea when they have certain gambling laws, and certain games fall under that. Are you familiar with that kind of stuff, with Korean stuff?
Yeah, and it's not just Korea, actually. The U.S. has some pretty restrictive gambling laws. So if you have, the ability to transfer value in your game, and the outcome of that transfer from either from the publisher or the developer to the user and back and forth, or between users, and there's some uncertainty there, like there's some development or some dependence on chance, you're probably running afoul of certain state gambling laws in addition to, different parts of the world. But yeah, Korea is very restrictive, where the value can not necessarily even be an actual monetary value, or it doesn't even need to necessarily be exchangeable for a monetary value. So if you have a fake casino inside of, say, Fallout, right? New Vegas probably looked a lot different in its Korean release than it did in its US release. Right. So
yeah. Well, we have a client who ran into an issue because it was a match 3 game, right? And everything was random. The good news is that it was all randomized, right? So you didn't know where the color matches or the cubes or whatever it is they were utilizing were going to pop up, right, within the game. But if at the end of the game, if you got done with that round, if you didn't win, then you could pay money to get other chances to finish the game or win the game. Well, in Korea, that's restricted because they're saying it's a game of chance. You're asking people to put down money to win, and they view basically winning monetarily and getting the satisfaction of winning as the same thing.